Hello, this is Digital Accessibility, the people behind the progress. I'm Joe Walensky, the creator and host of this series. And as an accessibility professional myself, I find it very interesting as to how others have found their way into this profession. So let's meet one of those people right now and hear about their journey. All right, well, here we go with another episode where I have the opportunity to meet with an accessibility practitioner. And today I'm very excited to be speaking with Derek Featherstone. Hello, Derek. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well, Joe. How about you?
Everything's going pretty well. As usual, I'm in my home office on Vashon Island, which is near Blink's Seattle headquarters. Where are you talking to me from?
I am based here in Ottawa, Canada.
All right. Well, it's one of the cities in Canada I haven't visited yet, but I definitely want to get there at some time to check it out. Well,
Beautiful.
thanks for being part of this, and yeah, I think probably a lot of people that may be listening to this are familiar with you already, but I'm looking forward to learning a little bit about your background and how you got here. But always a good place to start is if you could just talk a little bit about what you're up to right now.
Yeah, so right now I am the VP of Product Accessibility and Inclusive Design at Salesforce. I started here in mid-January of this year of 2022, and loving it. It's a wonderful place to work and have a great team surrounded by a load of people that care really deeply about accessibility. So super happy to be here right now.
But a lot of people may know you from your contributions to the community through quite a lot of training programs and things like that. Are you still involved in those areas?
A little bit less frequently now, mostly because things changed in in 2020, and I haven't really traveled all that much. Although I still do quite a bit of conference speaking, or have done over the years, and put together workshops and that sort of thing, and I still do that. Just definitely not as frequently right now. Although I am getting to the point where I think I'm kind of ready to begin another wave of traveling a little bit more and speaking at conferences again, and doing workshops. I spend a lot of that time, or some of that time, some of the time that I spend doing that kind of work, I do that internally at Salesforce, and not really doing a whole lot in terms of workshops publicly right now, but that may change over the next little while.
Well, the pandemic certainly did change the dynamics for a lot of things. The CSUN conference this year was the first physical event I'd been to in probably 2 years, so it was nice to get back out there and participate in that.
Yeah.
I'm sure your activities in Salesforce keep you busy on a regular basis, but are you able to talk about maybe any of the things that kind of make up your kind of week in the life for Derek there, or possibly talk a little bit about how accessibility is structured within the organization? Are you part of an overarching group, or do you get in with individual divisions or product groups?
Yeah, so I'll give you kind of the brief high level thing, and I think this is an interesting piece when it comes to Salesforce. Our group, the Product Accessibility and Inclusive Design team, is actually part of our Office of Ethical and Humane Use. Now that's still part of our product organization, which is often where accessibility sits from an organizational perspective, but our work being so closely tied to ethics, and that sense of responsibility actually is really quite interesting. I've never really seen it done or heard of it being uh, situated within an office such as like an office of ethical and humane use. So I won't go into too much details, but that kind of situates where we are. The thing that I would say I spend a lot of my week doing is a lot of work connecting to other executives and other product people around the organization, helping them to move forward in terms of accessibility, because lots of teams don't really have a good plan or have some of the insights that they need, or maybe in some cases it's just awareness that they don't have the same awareness of accessibility as other teams. And so we want to move everybody in the same direction. And so I spend a lot of my time investing in connecting with other people and working with them to help them understand not not fine-grained requirements, although sometimes I do get involved with specific bugs or debates or questions that come up around or something really specific and technical. Quite often, though, it's really around big picture requirements and understanding what we need to do as an organization or as product teams that are working on accessibility in order for us to succeed. So a lot of my time is spent working in on those things and thinking about accessibility strategically and enacting that strategy with the help of our partners throughout the organization.
Well, I'd like to talk with you a little bit more about your current or most recent work. But one of the things I like to do with this program is to find out how people made their way to where they are today. Accessibility is still one of those areas where most people don't find their way into it through a formal education program. And so it tends to be something from lived life or a serendipitous event in our work life. So maybe let's go back into the past for you. And where did you first start to realize this might be a profession you'd be interested in?
Yeah, I'm happy to dig in a little bit there. And there's a long story behind it, and I will kind of go through the abridged version, and then feel free to ask a little bit more about certain areas. But for me, there's kind of a confluence of events, of things that I've been involved with over the course of my life. I have a disability myself. I was born with a club foot, which now that I am 51 is actually starting to have more impact on me than it did in my younger years. The flexibility in my left ankle is not really there, and that I have some flexibility, but probably about 2/3 of what I have in my right ankle, and that has surprising impacts on maybe on the way that I walk or the way that I feel pain up through my leg. My left leg is actually not the same size as my right leg. My right leg is significantly stronger because I think I've, over the course of 51 years, there's I was in a cast for quite a bit of time for the first, I think, I'm going to say 18 months of my life, and even later, I had surgery at 3 to release the club foot. But being in that cast actually has an impact on early muscle development and that kind of thing. And there may be some other reasons, but my right leg is significantly stronger, and that actually creates some imbalances that I notice in the workday, and that I actually even see in the screen right now, that I need to sit up and try and balance myself out a little bit more, because I'm a little bit imbalanced. Um, that doesn't have a massive impact on me now, but I assume that at some point in the future I may require accessible parking or something. I'm not really sure what that future holds for me. I do notice it more now, just in terms of a little bit more pain than I used to get. So that's like, point one. I also, as I was growing up, my grandfather had a stroke in the mid 1980s, and so I spent quite a bit of time just seeing the barriers um, that he experienced, I spent time living with my grandparents on, I think every summer as I was working in the city, kind of thing, and always needed to help him with certain things. Making sure that as he was going up the stairs, that he wasn't getting his toe caught on the stairs and falling down and that kind of thing, and helping him into the car and out of the car, because they had a low car, and there wasn't really a whole lot in terms of accessible transportation. And so there was a lot of things that I experienced there with him, and him trying to maintain his independence despite having a stroke. When I was going through school, I actually wanted to be a teacher, and I was a teacher for 5 years. I started teaching my first classes in 1993, teaching high school. And as I was teaching and learning about teaching people, I started to understand a little bit more about um, multiple intelligence theory, which isn't really a great word for it, but does kind of have, or taps into the notion of people learning in different ways. And that really resonated for me, that the messages that I was trying to teach my students when I was teaching high school biology, chemistry, and computers, those messages were for everybody, not just for the people that were already, sciency, mathematical, already kind of headed in that direction. If I wanted to teach people and have um, young teenagers turn into responsible citizens that had a background in science and could think with that science-based lens, then I needed to make sure that the lessons I was teaching resonated for everybody. And so I would do things like, I would get some of the students that were more focused on the arts, I would get them to write poetry about science concepts as a way to demonstrate some of the ways that they were understanding things. And I tried to get creative with that, and really tried to make sure that the messages became a thing that were for everyone. And so when I started getting into the web, that relationship to accessibility, about this being for everyone, really, really connected with me. So I started working on the web when I was teaching. I actually started creating web-based resources for my students and for my my co-teachers, and going through that in the mid 1990s was like the heavy browser war era where like we were using Internet Explorer 3 and Netscape Navigator Gold 3.2, and there was differences between the browsers. And so when I was creating things and I couldn't get them to show up in one browser versus another, that led me down a path of figuring out why. And that led me to concepts like validation of HTML, because that was a good way to ensure that my HTML that I was writing by hand was nested properly. Because if you were writing something for, if you were creating a table, for example, and you missed a closing table row tag or a closing table tag, or you nested something incorrectly, Netscape 3.2 just showed a blank page. It didn't render the entire page because your HTML was not well formed. So that was a thing where validation became a thing right away for me. And validation led me also to learn about concepts like missing alt text and form labels, and form labels that were connected to their form fields by the for attribute and the ID. So that validation aspect of it became really important, and it exposed me to some accessibility principles very early on that actually led me more into accessibility. And so as I started to create more web-based resources, accessibility was just a natural thing. It felt obvious to me, and a thing that we wanted to make sure that was part of everything that we created. Everything needs to be accessible. I eventually left teaching and started my own web company in 1999. And I was not only building websites, I was also teaching people how to build websites. It made sense to me to use my teaching background to do that. And so I've been teaching and building websites since then professionally. And that was something where it became really clear to me that there were not a lot of people that understood or that were talking about or were encouraging accessibility as a practice, as part of what we do. And so it was there from kind of the moment that I started, and it was something that I've just been trying to share over and over and over again. And I think in probably around 2005, about 6 years into it, I started to get invited to some conferences, and people were asking me specifically to speak about accessibility because they were seeing that it was becoming increasingly important, and they wanted people that could guide people, that could inspire people, and most importantly teach people so that they were learning things about accessibility. And so I was all in on that because I wanted to keep teaching and using my teaching background. So when you put all of that together, that ultimately led to, in around 2004, 2003, 2004, 2005, where I just really started to focus on the accessibility side of things. And gradually over time, that's what we became. I created Simply Accessible. Out of that, that was my company that we grew, and did lots of very design centric accessibility work, very user focused accessibility work. And that led to a point where ultimately we got acquired by Level Access in 2018, and I was chief experience officer there for 4 years. And then that's kind of how I ended up here. Over time, just kind of that accessibility continued to grow as my focus, and that's led me to where I am here. I said I was going to give the short version. I think I gave the long version, so I hope that's all okay.
Yeah, no, that's great. But you went through a lot of things. So let me just check back with some of it. Just with a couple of comments and question. First of all, thanks for sharing the information about your own physical challenges. I think that always helps us have a broader understanding of what's involved in this field. And then I hadn't known about you being a teacher, but all the online classes and the things that you have done at conferences have all been really very good instructional activities. So I guess that makes sense that you had that background. Or do you not feel like that contributed to it?
Oh, I think it has, for sure. I mean, it's at the heart of most of the things that I do, that I want to teach. And I tend to think about things in a very specific way when I'm creating something, whether it's a conference talk or one of my courses that's on LinkedIn Learning. I go through a process where I'm thinking about the learning outcomes that I'm after. And it's I break it down into these four categories. There's things that I want people to know. There's things that I want them to do or be able to do. So that's like the knowledge and awareness, but there's also skills and behaviors that we need to encourage. There's things that I want people to feel, and then there's things that I want people to be. Right? So I go through this framework of know, do, feel, be, and it lets me create this overall picture of, this is what I'm aiming for here. And so it's always a combination of things that I just want people to know, things that I want them to do, or actions that I want them to take, things that I want them to feel. And in a lot of ways, I might say, if I'm doing a conference talk, I might write down that I want people to feel empowered to take action tomorrow, right? Like, I want them to be able to go and take action and improve their practice tomorrow using X technique or something like that. So there's things I want them to feel empowered. And then the things that I want them to be tend to be kind of those aspirational things. I want them to be a responsible designer, or I want them to be a more inclusive researcher, that includes more people with disabilities in the research that they're doing. So I've got those ideas, and I think that comes from my teaching background, because that's ultimately how we design learning activities and curriculum. It's focused on those kind of facets of learning outcomes. So I think it's heavily influenced by my background as a teacher.
The other thing then you got to the point where you were doing the your website consulting and accessibility work. So early 2000s, that's kind of when I think of the time where a lot of the pieces were in place to start turning this into, a profession, or having some momentum where some real improvements were being made with the WCAG having been developed by the W3C, and the legislative requirements coming into play. How did it feel for you at that time? Were you kind of aware that there was this practice building, or were you more or less just reacting to things going on within your own consulting with your clients?
It's a little bit of both. You could tell, like, it felt, and that's a very kind of vague way of talking about it, but you could feel a groundswell, and that more and more people, that it was gaining momentum, that it was going to be more and more important, and ultimately it was, yeah, there was definitely some reaction to what was being asked for. But we got to a point where we were reacting like, yes, there's more demand for this, and then we turned that into, okay, there's no more reacting to this, let's be proactive about it, and here's what we're going to drive and create as a company. And so that was, it was kind of a combination of both of those things, but you could definitely tell that it was going to continue to become important. I think I wrote an article once about, what steps you need to take to become an accessibility consultant. And in the very early days, it was literally go get a business card and write your name on it and accessibility consultant underneath. Because in the beginning, none of us were trained for this. There was no curriculum, there were no programs, there wasn't anything that like obviously led to this as a career path. And wow, that has changed over the last 23 years. It's definitely different now. There's programs out there. There is certification programs out there. There's just a lot more understanding about accessibility, and there's positions at organizations like accessibility product managers. And I think LinkedIn posted something about this just within the last couple of weeks. They have an entire section when you are adding your job to your LinkedIn profile. There are a group of, I think it's maybe 20, or maybe it's not quite that many, but there's a list of accessibility specific jobs that exist in LinkedIn now. And that just further goes to show that this is going to continue to be important when a platform like LinkedIn adds that to their product, to their service. That's saying something. That's a big recognition of the importance of accessibility in the space in which we all work. So it's definitely very different now than it was when I first started out.
Yeah, I've noticed that myself. I kind of keep up on things along those lines. I teach at the University of Washington, so I'm always kind of interested in that in terms of helping my students understand potential skill opportunities. But getting back to your journey, kind of the next part that you mentioned was having your own business that then was acquired by Level Access. So, like in that period where you're actively supporting clients, I'm just curious about like how you felt in terms of where you are making your biggest impact. Being in the consulting area myself, sometimes I think that the majority of interest comes from that desire for compliance or not to run into legal issues, the auditing portion, whereas I tend to feel that getting involved early and understanding at the research and design level can kind of take care of that if you follow through the process. But I don't know, maybe just talk a little bit about what that dynamic was for you and your experiences.
It changed over time, and the demand in the beginning, or the work that we were doing, in a lot of ways was very much along the lines of, yes, we'll consult with you, and yes, we can do an assessment of where you are and where your product is, and we can help you, we can help you fix that. But what we found was that over time, organizations started to realize that accessibility is not successful if you're thinking of it as a one-time thing. And so what we started to see was a little bit of a transformation. And what we started to see in terms of that change was organizations understanding, or us helping them to understand, that they needed to move from project to program, that they couldn't be just thinking of accessibility as a project that they're going to do for a year and then they don't need to touch it again for like 6 years. Right? It just doesn't work that way. It's not successful that way. So that was the biggest transformation in mindset, and that was more focused on helping our clients understand that a project focus is fine for that project, but that it ultimately needs to bubble up to something bigger. It needs to be thought of programmatically, systemically, as a big picture thing that is part of the strategy of an organization moving forward, where you need to be strategic about it and think of it in scaling terms, think of it in program terms, and thinking of it in repeatability terms. That's the only way that you can be truly successful with it in the long run.
That philosophy of iteration and always continuing to move forward, I think, is really important. Uh, One of the things that I always like to ask in this program is kind of open ended. It's kind of maybe you reflecting on your overall career in this area. I know when I think back to when I was starting on this, like around 1998, thinking ahead, in some ways, I think I would have thought things would have been further along than they are. In other ways, I'm like amazed at what technology has been able to do, uh, to support with assistive technologies. I just wonder maybe if you have any thoughts about areas where you think there's gaps or where there's been amazing achievements, or kind of where you're thinking you're hoping things will go to in the future.
We've done a tremendous job on the engineering side of things, on the code side of things, but I still think there's a gap with understanding that accessibility is not just about the web content accessibility guidelines. The W3C even calls it out, or the education and outreach working groups and the web accessibility initiative itself. They actually say in their documentation, this is a great starting point. I'm super paraphrasing here. They don't say exactly this, but they often refer to certain concepts, and they'll say, make sure that you do user research to understand the full impact of this on people with different disabilities. There's people with disabilities. When you think back to WCAG 1.0 or even 2.0, there were lots of people with different disabilities that were not well represented in those early iterations of accessibility. And so there's lots of work going on right now with 2.1 and with 2.2, and even eventually whatever the next version of it is, that is starting to take into account things like different cognitive function, different cognitive disabilities, that just weren't in there. We're not even on the radar. Or, back in the 90s and the early 2000s, they might have been on the radar, but we didn't have good guidance or good ways of expressing those things or thinking about them or maybe objectively testing them. And so there's a big gap still when we think about accessibility holistically, because most organizations tend to think of it as an engineering function, as an engineering problem to be solved. And there's design that is there tangentially, but there's a lot of work to continue to do on the design side, on the research side, that takes us beyond this mode of compliance versus making things really functional, really easy to use, where we're creating great experiences so that people with disabilities don't have a minimally compliant interface where everybody else that doesn't have a disability gets something that's seamless and pleasing and a pleasure to use, right? Like those are the words that we use when we're thinking of creating great experiences for everybody else. And yet we're still in a mode where we're barely lucky to get to minimally compliance. And I'm talking industry. I'm not talking, about any specific organizations or companies, but the average, if you look at the Web A million, we don't even hit compliance for, so many websites. And so that to me is a gap. And that gap is born from, I personally think, not including people with disabilities as part of the process. And so the more that we can do that, and the direction that I think the industry is going to continue to move, is engaging people with disabilities as co-creators, as insightful contributors to the design problems that we are trying to solve, to the um, to be collaborators in the ways in which we create. And that to me is, that's where I think the industry goes. Despite all the things that we've accomplished, there's incredible things. I look at the things that we can do with ARIA right now that we had to find ways of faking it in the late 1990s and the early 2000s. There was no such thing as a live region back then, right? As something that would automatically announce this thing out as a status message. So back in the day, we had to create things that faked that. And they were actually excuse me, and they were actually in some ways disruptive, in that getting that feedback to a user on what was happening in the interface meant that we needed to take focus away from the thing that they were doing and then hope that we put them back in the right place after that message came up. But we don't really need to do that quite the same way anymore, because we've got accessibility mechanisms that we can use programmatically that do a pretty good job of getting us to where we need to be to represent that interface in a non-disruptive way. So that is incredible in itself, and I find it amazing that we have single page apps that power a lot of the world and that can be very highly accessible to a lot of people. We still have a long way to go, but that's still an accomplishment worth celebrating, that can be done. Now it's a matter of getting everybody on board and increasing the frequency with which that success happens.
Well, that's a great message that you had here for us at the end about just considering quality and the better inclusion and collaboration to truly make accessibility continue to move forward. It's been a pleasure speaking with you. We covered quite a lot in a relatively short amount of time, so I want to thank you for your contribution here, and look forward to hopefully seeing you in the physical world at some point in the future.
That would be wonderful, and thank you for the invite and the opportunity to share with people. I really appreciate it.
Thanks a lot, Derek.
Thanks, Joe.